When I was 13, my family had a tradition of spending a weekend in northern Michigan every October. My Uncle Jim owned a 4-acre property surrounded by dense forest. It was the perfect place for camping, hunting, and fishing. The property had a rustic charm, with a large cabin that could comfortably fit our entire family. The woods behind the cabin were vast and mysterious, filled with towering pines, winding deer trails, and the occasional rustle of leaves that made you wonder what was hiding just out of sight. Every year we'd spend our days exploring, fishing in the nearby creek, and sitting around the campfire at night, telling stories that sent shivers down our spines. One year, my brother Adam, our cousins Jake and Joe, and I decided to take our adventure a step further. We wanted to camp out in the woods, away from the cabin, just like real adventurers. Our dads, who were always up for a bit of fun, especially after a few beers, thought it was a great idea. They helped us set up a tent in a small clearing beyond the property line. The clearing was surrounded by tall trees, and the ground was covered in soft, mossy patches that my uncle called deer beds. He said it was the perfect spot for a campsite, and that he'd used it before during his hunting trips. Our moms weren't as enthusiastic about the idea. They thought we were too young to be out in the woods alone, especially at night. But our dads assured them we'd be fine. "They're close enough to hear their screams if something goes wrong," my dad joked. At the time, it was funny. Looking back, it feels like a strange foreshadowing. We spent the day playing outside, exploring the woods, and helping our dad set up the tent. By the time the sun started to set, we were excited, but also a little nervous. The woods looked different. At night, darker, quieter, and somehow bigger. Our dads walked us to the tent, gave us a quick lesson on how to use our flashlights, and left us with a final warning. Don't wander off and stay together. We crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and arranged our sleeping bags in a circle. I brought a deck of Uno cards, and we started playing by the light of our flashlights. For a while, everything was fine. We laughed, argued over the rules, and tried to scare each other with ghost stories. But then, we heard it, a scream. It was high-pitched and blood-curdling like a woman in distress. We all froze, our eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" Joe whispered, his voice trembling. I tried to stay calm and told everyone it was probably a fox. I'd read somewhere that foxes make sounds that resemble human screams. My explanation seemed to ease their nerves, and we went back to playing Uno. But then it happened again. This time the scream was louder and closer. It didn't sound like a fox anymore. It sounded human. The air in the tent grew heavy, and the playful mood vanished. We turned off our flashlights and huddled together in the dark, listening intently. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our shallow breaths. That's when we heard the footsteps. They were fast and deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves and twigs on the forest floor. The sound grew louder as they approached the tent. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the fear radiating from my brother and cousins. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then came the scream. It was ear-piercing, gut-wrenching, and so loud it felt like it was inside my head. The tent started shaking violently, as if someone, or something, was grabbing it and pulling at the fabric. We all screamed, our voices blending into a chorus of pure terror. "Get out of the tent!" I shouted, fumbling with the zipper. One by one we scrambled out and ran into the woods, our flashlights bouncing wildly as we sprinted toward the cabin. The fear of being chased, of something lurking in the shadows, fueled our speed. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the cabin, where our parents were already outside, alerted by our screams. Our dads grabbed their rifles and headed into the woods to investigate, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of an animal, no evidence of a prank. The next morning we packed up the tent and brought it back to the cabin. None of us wanted to spend another minute in those woods. To this day, I don't know what was out there. Was it a prankster trying to scare us? A wild animal we couldn't identify? Or something else, something that didn't belong in this world? All I know is that the woods felt different that night. They felt alive, as if the trees themselves were watching us, waiting for us to make a wrong move. We never camped in those woods again. In fact, we didn't even play outside after dark for the rest of that trip. The experience left a lasting impression on all of us, a reminder that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are more than just stories. It was the summer of 2020, and the world felt like it was falling apart. The pandemic had locked everyone indoors, but for me, it was an excuse to escape. I've always been an avid backpacker, and the solitude of nature was my therapy. So I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and headed to Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. The park was eerily empty, which wasn't surprising given the lockdown and the thin layer of snow still covering the ground. The roads were quiet, and the usual bustle of tourists was absent. It felt like I had the entire park to myself. I drove for hours, winding through the mountains, until I found a secluded spot near a creek. The trailhead was deserted, and the only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots as I began my hike. The creek was about 1.5 miles from the trailhead, tucked away in a quiet valley surrounded by towering pines. The water was still, flowing despite the cold, and the sound of it bubbling over the rocks was soothing. I found a flat spot, a little ways off the path to set up camp. The air was crisp and the sky was a deep, cloudless blue. It was the kind of peace I had been craving. But peace was something I hadn't felt in a long time. Back in 2019, I'd made a mistake at work, a big one. I worked in finance, and a miscalculation on my part cost a lot of people a lot of money. My reputation took a nosedive, and the fallout was brutal. I was harassed relentlessly. Phone calls, texts, even threats. I had to change my number, move to a new apartment, and eventually quit my job. For months, I felt like I was being hunted. The harassment had stopped for a while, and I thought people had moved on. But that night by the creek, it all came rushing back. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the snow. I cooked some sausages on my portable stove and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. I rolled a joint and lit it, hoping it would help me relax. For a while, it worked. But then my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number with a 203 area code, Connecticut. The first text read, "How's your camping going, buddy?" My heart sank. I didn't recognize the number, and the tone of the message felt off. Before I could respond, another text came through. "It's beautiful out here." Then a third. "I see why you came up here." I was high, and the paranoia hit me like a freight train. My hands trembled as I typed out a response. "Who is this?" No reply. I stood up, scanning the darkening woods around me. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that, the forest was a wall of black. I grabbed my handgun from my bag, a Sig Sauer P365 I'd bought after the harassment started. I'd never fired it before, but holding it made me feel safer. I crouched by the fire, my eyes darting around the trees, waiting for something, anything, to move. The texts kept coming. "Doesn't matter anymore," they said. Then, "Have a good night's sleep." That's when I heard the footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, crunching in the snow. My heart pounded as I turned toward the sound, gripping the gun tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the ring of firelight. A flash of light, like someone taking a photo, illuminated the trees for a split second. Then the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. My phone dinged again. It was a picture of my tent, taken from just outside the firelight. I snapped. Adrenaline surged through me, and I fired 2 shots into the air. The sound echoed through the valley, and I heard running footsteps retreating into the woods. Whoever was out there wasn't expecting me to fight back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, the gun in my lap, staring into the darkness. The texts stopped, and the woods were silent except for the occasional crackle of the fire. 5. Years later, I still think about that night. The harassment never started again, and I've moved on with my life. But sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone, I feel that same unease creeping in. I keep my gun close, just in case. Whoever was out there that night, whether it was a prankster, a stalker, or something else, They taught me one thing. You can't always outrun your past, but you can be ready to face it.